Hey, Dr. Seegren here with another lecture on coronavirus. I hope you liked the last one. Something that I'm wondering more and more these days is, what's going to happen with all this and how's it going to end? When are we going to go back to life as normal? Going back to school, all those things. And, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering the same thing. So the next several lectures on coronavirus will be focused on this topic of what's actually going to happen to the world, and is there an ending to all this? What is that ending? Right now, I would say there's three potential options on how this could all end, and there may be more than that, but these are kind of the three that I could see happening. And the first and probably best option would be the idea of a mass quarantine effort and eventual eradication of the virus. This is probably the most optimistic option and would be the best in terms of fewer people getting sick, fewer people dying. But it's also probably the most challenging and least likely option. But let me describe how it works. Last lecture, we learned that viruses don't survive on their own. They don't eat food. They depend on other cells. They depend on a host, basically. And the whole goal of a quarantine or a shelter in place or a stay at home or a lockdown or whatever you want to call it is that you are trying to deprive the virus of host. You're trying to reduce the number of hosts that the virus can infect. The idea is that if somebody is sick with the virus, they will either develop an immunity to it, and we'll talk about what that means over time as their body kind of fights it off, or unfortunately they might get sick and die. There's really two options there when you get a virus in you. And if you're not allowed to pass that virus on to somebody else, the virus, one way or another, is going to end in your body. So that's why governments around the world are taking these efforts to quarantine. The idea is that if we wall everybody off and the virus cannot spread from person to person, that it will cease to be. It will actually go extinct if you let this happen for long enough time. Has this ever happened before with the virus? Yeah, actually, most new outbreaks of new viruses, this is how they resolve. So if you look at SARS-CoV-1 from the early 2000s, it infected some 8,000 to 9,000 people, but eventually it went extinct. Quarantine efforts worked. The virus spread from person to person for a while, but then everybody went on lockdown and the virus had nowhere to go and it died. Ebola in the 2010s, same thing, infected a lot of people, some 30,000 plus, and eventually, though, quarantine practices, better hygiene practices, the virus could no longer spread to more people and it went extinct. Is that going to happen with this virus? I don't know, and we'll talk more about these efforts in another video, but there are a couple things. Those two viruses I gave examples of already didn't get that high in case numbers. Right now, when I'm making this video, we're at 1.3 million people that have been confirmed to have it. Probably more have it that haven't been laboratory tested and confirmed. And when you have that many people that have it, your quarantine efforts have to be that much better. And because it's also in pretty much every country in the world, the quarantine efforts of every country everywhere have to be good to eradicate it. If one country slips up and it spreads and every other country has eradicated it except for this one country where it's still spreading, assuming there's still airports and some kind of movement of people to and from that country, it's going to crop up again. It's going to show up again. So option one would be the best, but it's also the most challenging, and I would say it's the least likely. Another reason why is that particularly in the United States, I'm not sure exactly how good our quarantine efforts really are. If we're trying to starve the virus of bodies, we probably should not be fighting over toilet paper in grocery stores, right? That is providing plenty of opportunities for that virus to move from person to person. So that's my opinion of option one. Option two is the vaccination route. So maybe we can't completely eradicate the virus, but through various practices that we take, we can reduce the spread of the virus so it's not just completely running wild, and we can buy enough time to develop something like a vaccine. And eventually this leads, if we can distribute the vaccine to everybody, the idea, we'll talk about what vaccines do in this lecture, everybody would be, or most people would be immune to the virus, and that's called herd immunity. And again, the idea is that you starve the virus of any new host that it can infect. And option three is probably the worst option. Option three is just, well, we can't really contain this thing, and we just kind of let it go its course. Lots of people are exposed to it. This image shows you, unfortunately, that a lot of people would die through this route. But eventually, if everybody or most people are exposed to it, the body will naturally develop an immunity to the virus. Most people would, and a lot of people would die. Most people would survive and become immune, and then again, the virus ends up being starved. There's nowhere for it to go. The interesting thing is about both options 2 and 3 is that that might not actually be the end of the story, and our lecture today will be explaining these last two options and sort of what might happen if we go those routes. And so the topic today is going to be about immune response, herd immunity, and viral evolution. So let's get into it. Let's first talk about this immune response. What exactly is an immune response? I think most people are familiar that you have an immune system. This is how your body fights off infection. And generally, it's described that the immune system has two parts to it. One is called the innate immune system. This is your general immune system. So this is the part of the immune system that is kind of working against all diseases at once. An example of this would be a white blood cell. That's what's in the picture here. White blood cells are these specialized cells in your body that basically gobble up anything that doesn't belong. We call those pathogens. So something like a bacteria, if it's in your body, white blood cell, it'll find it and basically eat it. You've probably seen these before. If you ever get a cut and it gets a little bit infected, so maybe it has a little bit of that like white, yellow pus stuff, that white, yellow pus stuff is actually generally kind of the battle between white blood cells and bacteria. The white blood cells eat the bacteria are trying to eat the white blood cells, and the result of that sort of battle is just this nasty pus stuff in your wound. So that's always going on. When you're talking about becoming immune to a virus, that is something different. That is the adaptive immune system, and this is a specific immune response. So it's not working against everything all the time. This is actually working against specific diseases, specific contagious diseases. And the example here would be antibodies. And I'm going to explain what an antibody is next. The adaptive immune response is unbelievably complicated. I remember one of the few times in colleges where I just kind of threw my hands up and said, I'm not getting an A on this test. Was the molecular biology of immune response. It's unbelievably complicated, but the general gist of it is that antibodies are made by cells in your body to bind to pathogens. So In this little diagram, the little yellow Y-shaped things are actually antibodies, and these we talked some last lecture about how viruses have these binding proteins, these keys that kind of open the locks to our cells. Antibodies are kind of like keys too. They are little tiny proteins that go and instead of killing a virus, all they do is basically stick to their binding protein. So the virus wants to use its key to open a cell, but what an antibody does is that it basically latches onto that key and blocks it from working, and actually will sort of mark the virus as something that a white blood cell should eat as well. And so how this works in your body, the short way of it is that you have these specialized cells that kind of study any kind of virus or pathogen in your body and produce an antibody that then targets that virus, binds to it, and stops it from working. And once your cells have figured that out, the virus is done for, basically. So when you get the flu and you feel really, really sick, when you start feeling better again, that is almost certainly because your cells have figured out a way to create an antibody that binds to that flu virus and shuts it down. So that's an antibody. And the neat thing about antibodies is that once you have figured them out for a virus, you have them for life. So once you get sick from something, you won't get sick from it again. You might be asking yourself, wait, but I've gotten the flu more than one time in my life. We'll get to that later on. So vaccines rely on antibodies as well. What a vaccine is basically a chopped up virus. That's literally what it is. So you take a virus and you chop it up, and all the little bits of the virus are there, including that binding protein that binds to your cells. But because it's chopped up, it's not actually a living virus that can infect you. It's just a dead virus. So a bunch of chopped up viruses. You inject this chopped up virus into your bloodstream, and those cells that are supposed to detect things and create antibodies to bind to them pick up on these little bits of chopped up viruses and produce antibodies. Even though they're not infecting you, they still produce antibodies for those proteins in the virus. That means that when the virus actually comes to you and infects you, you already have the antibodies that bind and shut down the virus. There's probably some discussion about how long would it take for a vaccine to actually roll out and be useful. There are trials already going on for several vaccines, to my knowledge. Vaccines aren't too hard to make. They are hard to scale up and make a lot of them and actually distribute. So when we talk about how it might be months or years before we can widely distribute a vaccine, it's more of the scaling up of the vaccine that's hard, not necessarily making a vaccine itself. Just something that's interesting. The idea, though, with something like that is that you acquire herd immunity for your population. So if enough people are immune to a virus, then the virus has nowhere to go in that population. So quarantines can effectively starve viruses, but also this concept of herd immunity can also starve a virus. There's just nowhere for the virus to go. So hopefully that kind of wraps up your understanding of the immune system and vaccines and how those two things would work. Would they work for this virus? Potentially. Potentially not, though. And that we are going to have to get into the topic of viral evolution. So just as kind of a refresher on evolution, maybe you don't know much about it, or you haven't, you forgot about it. I would say there's kind of 4 key steps or ingredients to evolution working. The first is that there is some kind of variation in a population. So variation, there's differences between organisms in their traits. So some organisms are big, some are small, some are strong, some are fast, etc. The second step is the survival of the fittest. The idea that the strongest variations are going to survive, are going to be the healthiest, and are going to reproduce the most. Okay, so of all the variations out there, whatever the most strong or fit is going to make it. The third is that there is something called inheritance. So whatever variations were the strongest or most fit, capable of surviving and reproducing, their offspring, their children, will be more likely to inherit those traits. And the last ingredient is that mutations, which are simply mistakes in copying the DNA recipe for organisms, create new variations. So when we're talking about when we're talking about variation that's being passed to an offspring, what's actually being passed on is the recipe. A mutation would be a mistake in that recipe. Most mistakes are not good, but there could be a mutation that is helpful. I think earlier this year with my class, I discussed how some people are born with 6 fingers instead of 5. This can be very good at playing the piano, but generally speaking doesn't mean that you're more capable of surviving and reproducing. So, doesn't necessarily go anywhere. But that is an example of a new trait that could be useful in certain scenarios. And that's how we get new types of variation. If you put all these together, life kind of has to evolve. Right. Well, once again, I think my dogs can help teach us a little bit about evolution here. Here they are. Oh, man. Uh-oh, they're too close. All right. How are you two doing? Once again, my dogs can provide us a little insight on evolution. Here's Luna and Pete. You got something to say? As you can tell, these are 2 dogs, they're brother and sister. There is a ton of variation between the 2. If you look at Luna, we'll start with her. Luna is considerably smaller than Loki. She's only about 35, 40 pounds. And you can see her body, her frame is, she's got bigger hind legs. She's kind of a normal looking dog. Come here, Buck. Come here. What are you doing over there? Come on over. Loki on the other hand. There, boy. Oh my gosh. You can see Loki's considerably bigger. If you look at his neck and his head, he's more, I guess, hyena shaped compared to Luna. He's got a big old chest, and Luna maybe a little bit more like a fox or something. Oh, sweet dog. So there's a ton of variation between these 2 dogs. So that would be step 1. Step 2 would be survival. So if you put these 2 dogs out in the wild, which one would do better on their own in terms of finding food and reproducing? Probably neither of them would do good, but you can see when you're talking about evolution, one variation being stronger than the other, you're not literally meaning stronger. You're meaning which one is more capable of surviving. Loki is literally stronger, but he's also considerably slower. Luna's pretty quick. She's agile. Luna actually catches way more lizards than Loki. Oh, look at them. They're being so good. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So which one actually would be better at survival? There's no pill. All right, but let's say, just for example, Luna, because she's a little bit smaller, a little bit quicker, she can actually catch food, feed herself. Loki is too big and too slow, can't catch anything. Luna, because she is better at surviving, would presumably have more opportunities to mate and reproduce, and her babies would be more Luna-like than Loki-like. And so, Luna's puppies would also be good at surviving in the environment. And over time, if you had a whole bunch of these dogs out there, slowly everything would get more Luna-like, and the Lokis of the world would slowly die out. And then the kind of icing on the cake of this, the step 4, was that if you have something that you think is a good variation in the environment, there's always the opportunity for new mutations to arise that would create additional variations that could even be better in any particular environment. On top of that, the environment changes. So whatever variation is good at one point in time may not be all that great at another point in time. So thank you guys. You did great. Now we kind of have a better understanding of evolution. We know that evolution happens, it depends on 4 things, but it also depends on the environment of an organism. So what is actually the strongest and most fit organism depends on the environment it's in. And we have to kind of put ourselves in the mind of a virus when we talk about viral evolution. What is the viral environment like? When we're talking about what traits might be good for a fox or a hyena to live, they wouldn't be the same for a virus, right? Viruses don't eat, they don't have to catch food. All they do is bump around and bump into cells. That's kind of what a virus does. And we can almost kind of retrace the life of a virus. Every virus would be born into a cell, and its parents basically latched on that cell and shot in its DNA. We learned about that last lecture. And eventually, one way or another, this virus gets out of the cell. Either the cell ruptures or the virus is transported out of the cell somehow. And then once it's out of the cell that it was born in, all it does is basically bump around in the world. They don't swim. They're not moving around. They just kind of ride whatever they can, whatever kind of fluid movements there are, if they're in blood or if they're in the air, whatever. They're just kind of bumping around until hopefully, if you're the virus, it bumps into another cell. And the binding protein on the outside kind of latches onto the cell, and then it can shoot its DNA inside and take over that cell and make new viruses. So that's kind of the life of a virus, the life cycle. And when you talk about what virus would be the strongest or the most fit, really it's whatever virus can find a new cell the best. And any strategy that it can take to find a new cell, as long as it works and it can keep infecting new cells, that's going to be effective. For the coronavirus, it's what we call a respiratory virus. This is a virus that typically infects the respiratory tract, the lungs, and the throat. And the idea is that new viruses, when you cough, you are basically launching new viruses out into the world. And some percentage of those new viruses are going to land inside the lungs or the nose of, or the mouth of some other person, and it's going to be able to infect those new cells that way. All kinds of viruses have different strategies. Like, I think probably the most bizarre would be rabies. It's a virus that infects the nervous system of animals, but also is active in the saliva. And the way rabies has figured out a way to get into new organisms is by messing up the brain of the organism to make the animal it's in more violent and more aggressive, so that it's more likely to bite something, and then the rabies in the saliva can make it to the new organism through that route. So there's no, just kind of like talking about the dogs, Luna and Loki, there's no perfect organism or perfect route that something can take to reproduce and survive. Same thing happens with viruses. Pretty much anything that can keep infecting cells is going to work. And what this means is that generally viruses evolve to become more contagious, not necessarily more lethal. If you have 2 viruses, one that is super deadly but not very contagious, and one that is super contagious but not very deadly, which one is actually going to be more successful in infecting and surviving? The deadly disease that's not very contagious, kills its host, and that's it. It's gone. The infectious disease spreads to 5 people and then 5 other people and keeps spreading like that for a really long time. So that, I think a lot of people have it in their mind that when we talk about a virus evolving, it's, oh my God, it's going to get more deadly. Generally speaking, the opposite is true. Whatever mutations lead to it infecting more people is going to be the more fit route for a virus. And something that is more deadly, if it results in a dead end and not more infection, then that's actually not going to, that's going to drive itself extinct faster. So that's just an interesting point to consider. And let's tie all this together. What does this mean for the coronavirus? Unfortunately, we've been focusing on this idea that vaccinations or exposure can actually lead to herd immunity, where most people are immune to the virus. And that immunity is driven by antibodies. And remember, antibodies are these little tiny things that latch onto the virus. And I think I also asked that question of, well, if I got the flu and I beat the flu and I developed antibodies for the flu, why 3 years later did I get the flu again? And the answer is that viruses can evolve to evade antibodies. If you imagine the viral environment where slowly more and more humans are having these antibodies, and this virus needs to keep infecting new humans to survive, any mutation where the antibodies no longer can stick to the virus are going to be what we call selected for. They're going to survive better than the virus that gets bound to by the antibodies. And so these mutated viruses are just going to, any mutation where these antibodies don't work anymore on it, we would call that a new strain. And the idea is that you were immune to that other strain, but now your antibodies are no longer all that effective against this new type of virus. The million-dollar question right now is that what's going to happen eventually with the coronavirus if we're thinking forward a year from now? And I would think that is actually likely. Remember, the human coronavirus is the common cold. Everybody has caught the common cold multiple times in their lifetime, and if you wanted to vaccinate against the common cold, it probably would not work. There's just too many different, it's too abundant. There's too many possibilities for new mutations and new strains, and then you have a new virus and your vaccine doesn't work against it. The same thing happens with the flu. Your flu shot is a vaccine against most of the flu strains in circulation in the world. I got a flu shot this year. I still got the flu. That's because you can vaccinate against all the strains. And as soon as you do vaccinate against a bunch of the strains, any strain that can avoid those antibodies is going to be growing in more abundance because it's the one that can survive. And so the idea that a vaccine is going to rescue us with this coronavirus, I'm not so sure. And this is also relevant to antiviral medications. Antiviral medications are medications that aren't vaccines. They don't depend on antibodies. They're actually attempting to disrupt the virus. So, for example, one of the ones that maybe if you watch the news you've heard a lot about, chloroquine or hydrochloroquine. The actual science of why that might work against a virus is that it changes the acidity of certain aspects of your cells, and the viruses seem not to like that as much. So the virus doesn't replicate as much or as quickly in your body because it doesn't like the cellular configuration as much. Well, if people start using chloroquine widespread, any virus that can tolerate those higher acidities are going to do better, and then you have a new strain that can work around hydrochloroquine. This has been tested for a variety of situations, and almost all viruses do manage to kind of evolve and change and work their way around antiviral medications. That's why we have to continually develop new HIV and AIDS medications. To add to that, the coronavirus is what's called an RNA virus. RNA is kind of like DNA, except it's less stable, and it, generally speaking, when you're copying the recipe, an RNA recipe, the copying process is more likely to make mistakes. So RNA viruses are notorious for having the highest mutation rate out of any other life form in existence. So unfortunately, the idea that a vaccine could work on this may not happen. We'll have to see. That is kind of pretty conceptual right now, but that's my understanding, is that a vaccine is probably not going to eradicate this from the world. So what's going to happen over time? How long could this last? The good news is, like I was saying, generally speaking, viruses evolve to become more contagious and less lethal. And part of what makes them evade antibodies when they evolve new strains means that they're actually not as good at binding to our cells anymore, right? So if the antibody binds to their key, and their key has to change to avoid that binding, that key is going to work less well on our cells because, you change the key a little bit and now it doesn't fit as well into the cells. And so generally speaking, as this progresses over time, over years potentially, I think my guess is what would happen is that the virus will actually become less pathogenic, less lethal over time. And you hear scientists discussing this, the idea that this new coronavirus could become what's called endemic to humans. So instead of being this foreign novel coronavirus, over time, kind of everybody is exposed to it, people develop antibodies, it mutates, it gets less effective at infecting us, and it kind of just turns into any other disease, kind of like the flu or the common cold, given enough time. That is a possibility with this one. That's looking way, way out ahead of how this might end, but it also gives you a perspective that, this probably isn't going to end, next week. This could be quite a long time before it ends, and we will talk a little bit about the epidemiology, how this thing will spread, and exactly what the numbers are going to look like over the course of the next few months in these different scenarios. I hope I'm wrong about all that, and that option one actually works, and that we somehow killed this thing off and we don't even need vaccines or anything like that, but I'm a little skeptical at the moment. So let's wrap all this up. I know that was a lot. This one went longer than the last one. When we talk about how this is going to end, generally speaking, I think the most likely scenario is that we are going to acquire some kind of immunity to the current coronavirus, either through exposure of a lot of people or through vaccination. And once majority of us are immune to it, there is going to be pressure on the virus to basically evolve and work its way around that immunity. In the process, hopefully that will make it less deadly, and it kind of just turns into any other sort of human respiratory virus slowly over time. We'll see. That's my current prediction. Stay safe, stay away from it, stay indoors, and we'll talk some more about this stuff next week.